The wedding invitation had been beautiful. Embossed gold lettering on cream cardstock announcing the marriage of my younger sister Jessica to her fiancé Michael. What hadn't been beautiful was the phone call from my mother 2 weeks before the ceremony. "Catherine, we need to discuss the seating arrangements for the wedding," Mom had said, her voice carrying that apologetic tone she used when delivering unwelcome news. I was in my Senate office reviewing healthcare legislation when the call came in. At 38, I'd spent the last 6 years serving as the junior senator from our state, but I kept my political career largely separate from family gatherings. My family knew I worked in government, but they'd never paid attention to the specifics. "What about the seating?" I'd asked, minimizing the budget proposal I'd been reviewing. "Well, Jessica wants the ceremony to look perfect for the photos. Michael's family is very traditional. They expect to see couples and families properly arranged. And you know how these formal events work, dear. Married couples in the front rows, families with children in the middle sections." I'd waited for the actual point. "We thought it would be best to seat you in the back section, behind the columns. You'll still have a lovely view and it won't look unbalanced." "Unbalanced? Keep the lonely one in back," Dad insisted. Mom had continued, apparently quoting a conversation I hadn't been part of. "You understand, single people can sometimes make the photos look odd when everyone else is paired up." I'd stared at the wall of my office, where framed photos showed me with the President, the Speaker of the House, and various world leaders at policy summits and state functions. "I see. You're not upset, are you? It's nothing personal. Jessica just wants everything to look traditional and complete." "Of course. You're such a good sport, Catherine. Jessica was worried you'd make a fuss." After hanging up, I'd sat in my office for a long time, looking at the legislative calendar on my desk. The wedding was scheduled for the same weekend as the Senate Judiciary Committee's emergency session on healthcare reform, legislation I'd been shepherding for 2 years. I'd made a choice about which commitment to honor. Build up. The back row experience. The morning of Jessica's wedding, I arrived at St. Mary's Cathedral to find the seating exactly as Mom had described. The front rows were reserved for immediate family, the middle sections for couples and families with children, and the back section, behind the massive stone columns that blocked most of the view, for single guests and distant relatives. They'd hidden me behind the columns. I found my assigned seat in the last row, next to Great Aunt Margaret and a few college friends of Jessica's who apparently also didn't fit the traditional family aesthetic Mom had been aiming for. "Ridiculous seating arrangement," Aunt Margaret muttered as she squinted toward the altar. "Can't see a thing from back here." "It's fine," I said diplomatically, checking my phone for updates from my chief of staff about the committee session. The text from David read, "Healthcare vote moved to 2 p.m. Press conference at 3. Senator Williams asking where you are." I typed back, "Family wedding. Handle the preliminary questions. Will join remotely if needed." "Catherine." Jessica appeared in her wedding dress, glowing with pre-ceremony excitement. "I'm so glad you could make it. Wouldn't miss it. I know the seating is a little scattered, but we wanted to make sure all the couples were positioned prominently for photos." "I understand. Michael's family is very focused on appearances. His father is running for city council, so there will be some local politicians here." I looked around the church, noting several faces I recognized from state party functions and policy meetings. Councilman Peters from the 3rd District. State Representative Morris. A few county commissioners. Local politicians who definitely knew who I was, but who were apparently seated far enough away not to notice me tucked behind the stone columns. "That's nice," I said. "His father specifically asked that we seat people by importance level. You know how politics works." I did know how politics worked. Better than anyone in the church, actually. Around 11:45, I noticed a commotion near the main entrance. A group of serious-looking individuals in dark suits were speaking with the church coordinator, showing credentials and surveying the venue. I recognized the team immediately, Congressional Security Detail, the same group that provided protection for high-ranking government officials during public events. My phone buzzed with a call from David. "Senator Morrison, I need to brief you on a situation. The healthcare vote has been moved up due to breaking news. CNN is reporting that the opposition is planning to file an injunction to block the legislation." "What kind of injunction?" Constitutional challenge. They're claiming the bill exceeds federal authority. Legal counsel needs your input immediately. I'm at my sister's wedding. I understand, but this could kill 2 years of work. Can you join a conference call? I looked around the church where my family was preparing for what they considered the most important event of the year, completely unaware that I was simultaneously managing federal legislation that would affect millions of people. Set up the call for noon. I'll take it during the reception if needed. Senator, there's one more thing. The press has gotten wind of your location. Apparently, someone from the local paper spotted the security detail and started asking questions. I watched the congressional team arrive. Through the church's stained glass windows, I could see additional black SUVs pulling into the parking lot. The congressional security detail was taking no chances with a senator's safety, even at a family wedding. The irony wasn't lost on me. My family had hidden me in the back of the church because I didn't fit their image of success, while federal security teams were surrounding the building because of my actual position in government. Mom appeared in the back row looking flustered. Catherine, there are some very official-looking people asking about you. They have badges and everything. Government security, I said quietly. Security? For what? For me, Mom. For you? Why would you need security? Before I could answer, Agent Martinez from the Congressional Security Detail approached our row. Senator Morrison, he said respectfully, we've completed the perimeter security sweep. The venue is secure for the duration of the event. The silence in the back section was absolute. Great Aunt Margaret's mouth fell open. Jessica's college friends stared in confusion. Senator. Mom whispered. Revelation. The emergency session. The wedding ceremony proceeded beautifully, though I noticed increasing murmurs from guests who had spotted the security detail outside. Father O'Brien began the traditional wedding vows just as my phone vibrated with an urgent message from the Senate Majority Leader. Catherine, emergency vote called for 1 p.m. Healthcare bill under constitutional challenge. Need you on the floor, AD. I looked toward the altar where Jessica and Michael were exchanging rings, completely unaware that federal legislation affecting healthcare for millions of Americans was hanging in the balance while I sat hidden behind stone columns at their wedding. My phone rang. The caller ID showed Senator Williams, Judiciary Chairman. I quietly answered, whispering, Senator Morrison. Catherine, thank God. CNN just broke the story about the constitutional challenge. We need an emergency committee session. Can you join remotely? I'm at a family wedding. I understand, but this legislation dies if we don't act today. The opposition filed their injunction an hour ago. I looked around the church where 300 guests were focused on the ceremony, including several local politicians who still hadn't recognized me in the back row. Set up the remote connection. I'll join from here. From the wedding? It's the only option. The committee hearing news silenced the priest. 5 minutes later, Agent Martinez approached with a tablet and wireless headset. Senator, your secure connection to the Senate Judiciary Committee is ready. The conversation in the back rows stopped completely. Father O'Brien paused mid-blessing, distracted by the sudden appearance of federal technology during his ceremony. Jessica and Michael turned around, confusion evident on their faces as they watched their wedding ceremony being interrupted by what appeared to be a government briefing. I accepted the headset and tablet. Senator Morrison joining the emergency session remotely. Senator Williams' voice carried clearly through the church speakers that Agent Martinez had somehow connected to the system. Catherine, we've reviewed the constitutional challenge. The opposition is claiming our healthcare provisions exceed congressional authority under the Commerce Clause. That's a weak argument, I replied, my voice now audibly carrying through the church as guests turned to stare. Our legal counsel prepared for this exact challenge. The precedent from the 2019 Supreme Court ruling supports our position. Can you walk us through the constitutional argument? I stood up, tablet in hand, and began delivering a detailed legal analysis of federal healthcare authority while Jessica's wedding guests listened in stunned silence. The Commerce Clause clearly grants Congress the authority to regulate interstate healthcare markets, I explained, gesturing toward charts that were now being projected onto the church's large screen typically used for hymn lyrics. Furthermore, the Necessary and Proper Clause provides constitutional backing for the enforcement mechanisms we've included in Section 304 of the bill. Councilman Peters, seated 12 rows ahead of me, turned around completely, his face showing dawning recognition. Senator Morrison, Senator Williams continued, the opposition is claiming this exceeds the scope of congressional power. That argument failed in committee 6 months ago. I have the constitutional scholars' briefs supporting our position. The precedent is clear. Father O'Brien cleared his throat. Perhaps we could. One moment, Father, I said, still focused on the committee session. Senator Williams, I'm recommending we invoke the Emergency Procedures Clause and call for an immediate floor vote. The constitutional challenge is frivolous, and delay only serves their political strategy. The church had gone completely silent except for my voice explaining federal legislative procedure to a Senate committee while my sister stood at the altar in her wedding dress. Mom appeared beside me, her face pale. Catherine, what is happening? I'm managing federal healthcare legislation, Mom. Same as I do every day. You're a senator? Junior Senator Catherine Morrison, 6 years in office, currently chairing the subcommittee on healthcare innovation. Dad materialized in the back row, looking like he'd seen a ghost. You're Senator Morrison? The one on the news. Stat. I'm the one on the news. Representative Morris stood up from his seat in the middle section. Senator Morrison. I had no idea you'd be here. I've been hoping to discuss the rural healthcare provisions with you. The wedding had effectively stopped as federal and local politicians throughout the church began recognizing that the woman they'd hidden in the back row was one of the most influential legislators in the state. Senator Williams wrapped up the committee session. Motion approved. We'll proceed with the floor vote at 2 p.m. Thank you for your constitutional analysis, Senator. I removed the headset and looked around the church, where 300 wedding guests were staring at me in various stages of shock and recognition. Jessica found her voice first. Catherine, you're a United States Senator? Yes. For how long? 6 years. And you never told us? I looked at my family, who had spent years assuming I was an unsuccessful government clerk because I drove a modest car and lived quietly. You never asked. New positions, new respect. The wedding reception was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Instead of being seated at the singles table in the corner, I found myself surrounded by local politicians eager to discuss policy initiatives and business leaders interested in upcoming legislation. Senator Morrison, Councilman Peters said, approaching with obvious respect. I had no idea we had such distinguished family representation at this event. I prefer to keep my political career separate from family functions, I replied diplomatically. Your work on healthcare reform has been exceptional. The rural hospital provisions you championed have saved 3 facilities in my district. Throughout the evening, I found myself in substantive conversations about policy implementation, federal funding, and legislative priorities. The kind of discussions I typically had in Washington, not at family weddings. Jessica approached during the cocktail hour, still in her wedding dress but looking considerably more subdued than she had that morning. Catherine, I owe you an enormous apology. For what? For assuming you weren't important enough to sit with the family. If I'd known you were a senator, if you'd known I was successful, you would have treated me differently? Jessica paused, understanding the implication. That's not what I meant. But it's what you did. You seated me based on your assumptions about my importance, not on the fact that I'm your sister. Mom and Dad joined us, both looking uncomfortable. Catherine, Dad said, we had no idea about your accomplishments. I've been in the Senate for 6 years. I've been on the news, I've been quoted in newspapers, I've passed major legislation. But you never told us. I mentioned my work every time you asked. You just never listened because you assumed it wasn't important. Mom looked hurt. We would have been proud if we'd known. You should have been proud regardless. I'm your daughter and I've been working hard and serving the public for years. My job title shouldn't determine your pride in me. The conversation was interrupted by my chief of staff, who had arrived to brief me on the healthcare vote results. Senator, the floor vote passed 67 to 31. Your constitutional arguments carried the day. The opposition's injunction was dismissed. Excellent. Any press requests? CNN wants a statement about managing federal legislation during family events. They're calling it, Democracy Doesn't Take Wedding Days Off. Jessica listened to this exchange with growing amazement. You passed federal legislation during my wedding? I passed federal legislation that will provide healthcare access to millions of Americans, including rural communities that haven't had adequate medical services. The timing was coincidental. 3 months later, the family dynamic had shifted completely. My parents started asking detailed questions about my work and expressing genuine pride in my legislative achievements. Jessica and Michael invited me to speak at a political fundraiser they were hosting for local candidates. "I want people to know my sister is Senator Morrison," Jessica said when she introduced me at the event. But the most significant change was in how we communicated. Instead of making assumptions about each other's lives, we started having real conversations about our work, our goals, and our challenges. At Christmas dinner, Dad asked me to explain the healthcare bill's impact on their community. "Your sister's work is going to save the county hospital," he told visiting relatives proudly. "I always knew Catherine would do something important," Mom added. I smiled but didn't point out that they'd had no idea what I was doing for 6 years. Some progress is worth celebrating even when it comes late. I still prefer to keep my political career separate from family events, but now it's a choice rather than an assumption that my work doesn't matter. And I never sit behind columns anymore. Senator or not, I'm family, and family sits together.